At first light on a frozen frontage road outside Ogden, a county maintenance worker noticed a purse placed too neatly near a snow-stiff culvert. Frost sealing the weeds, tire tracks fatting, breath clouding the air as deputies marked distances, measured silence, and understood December had kept something for months, waiting for careful hands to arrive. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The woman would later be identified as Emily Ruth Calder, 22 years old, reported missing the previous spring and last seen before the first heat of summer. In Utah, winter has a way of preserving what the rest of the year erases, and the scene carried that lesson quietly. There was no chaos, no rush. Evidence markers were placed with gloved precision. Photographs were taken as the sky turned pale. Traffic was slowed and diverted. Radios stayed low. The location, a service pull-off used by plows and utility trucks, had been visited countless times without anyone noticing what December now revealed. Emily's disappearance had never been loud. She was a college junior commuting between Ogden and Logan, studying accounting, working evenings at a grocery store off Washington Boulevard. Her life, as reconstructed later through records and routine, followed the predictable rhythm familiar to older men who remember balancing work, school, and early responsibility. She called her parents weekly. She paid her bills on time. She drove a reliable sedan with high mileage and a cracked dashboard. When she missed Thanksgiving dinner in 1998, the absence felt wrong but not yet alarming. She had told her mother she might work extra shifts. By Christmas Eve, when calls went unanswered, the wrongness settled into something colder. Police reports from December 1998 show a measured response shaped by the era. A welfare check at her apartment found no sign of struggle. The bed was made. Winter clothes were missing. Her checkbook lay balanced on the counter. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. Flyers went up on corkboards at the grocery store and the campus library. Local papers ran a brief item between holiday ads and church schedules. The weather turned. Leads thinned. By New Year's Day, Emily Calder was classified as a missing adult, circumstances unknown. The discovery on that January morning in 1999 shifted the case into a different register. The medical examiner's initial assessment was cautious, shaped by cold preservation and time. Identity confirmation relied on dental records and a distinctive healed fracture in her left wrist from a childhood fall. Autopsy findings suggested exposure and blunt force trauma consistent with a fall or impact, but the context mattered more than any single mark. There were fibers on her coat inconsistent with the site. There was soil embedded in the soles of her boots that did not match the pull-off. There were ligature impressions faint enough to argue about, and the argument would last years. Investigators returned to the timeline with winter discipline. Emily's last verified activity was a grocery shift ending at 9:47 p.m. on December 23, 1998. Time clock records were clean. Surveillance cameras, analog and limited, showed her leaving alone, coat zipped, purse on shoulder. Her car was later found parked 2 blocks away, locked, dusted with snow after a storm. No signs of forced entry. No notes. Gas tank half full. The key detail, noted and then nearly lost, was a receipt in the glove box from a rural gas station north of town, time-stamped just after 10:30 p.m. That receipt sent deputies along plowed highways and county roads, the kind older drivers know well, lined with fields and closed fruit stands, sodium lights spaced far apart. The station attendant remembered a young woman buying coffee and asking about road conditions. He remembered because it was Christmas week and quiet, because she paid in cash, because she seemed tired. The register tape corroborated the time. Beyond that, the trail thinned again. Media attention flickered and receded. By February, the case sat in a file marked inactive, not forgotten but waiting. Emily's parents kept the flyers up through Easter. They held on to hope through the thaw, through graduation season, through another Thanksgiving that arrived with an empty chair. Detectives rotated. Budgets tightened. The evidence locker held fibers, soil samples, and a purse cataloged and sealed. What revived the case was not a confession or a dramatic tip, but procedure. In 2006, Weber County began a cold case review prompted by grant funding tied to evidence audits. An investigator nearing retirement, a man who had worked patrol before computers, pulled Emily Calder's file and read it end to end. He noticed the soil analysis had been incomplete, the fibers never compared beyond a limited local database. He requested updated testing. He requested a fresh look at phone records, now more accessible with improved retention agreements. The results were incremental and unglamorous. Soil matched a stretch of riverbank near a decommissioned warehouse south of Brigham City, a place used by anglers in summer and snowmobilers in winter. Fibers matched upholstery from a model of pickup common in the late 90s, not rare but narrowing. Phone records placed Emily's handset briefly pinging a tower near that riverbank after the gas station stop. It was enough to reopen doors. Investigators canvassed old names. One resurfaced with quiet insistence. Daniel Mercer, 31 in 1998, a seasonal warehouse contractor with a history of traffic stops along the same corridor. He owned a pickup matching the upholstery. He had been questioned once and released. His alibi had been thin but unchallenged. In 2006, records showed he had moved, married, divorced, and kept driving the same roads. A lawful search warrant executed in 2007 produced no dramatic finds, only maintenance receipts and a tarp purchase dated December 22, 1998. The significance emerged later, when a lab found trace fibers consistent with Emily's coat embedded in the tarp's weave. The linkage was cautious, statistical, and reviewed by defense experts. It held. Arrest came in November 2008, just before Thanksgiving, the timing unremarked by police but felt by the community. The courthouse was old stone and warm radiators. Files were heavy. The charge was second-degree murder. The evidence was circumstantial but layered, procedural, and patient. At trial, jurors heard about winter preservation, about routine, about how small records endure. They convicted in 2010. Daniel Mercer was sentenced to 25 years to life. In Ogden, December returned as it always does. Snow fell on roads and quiet pull-offs. Emily Calder's parents attended a memorial with no spectacle. The grocery store replaced its corkboard. The case file closed with a date and a signature, and the cold kept its distance. The conviction did not end the work for investigators who had lived with the case across decades. What followed was a careful accounting of how a young woman disappeared in plain sight during a season defined by family calendars and predictable routines. Records assembled after trial show how methodical review, rather than any single revelation, carried the weight. Emily Calder's movements were reconstructed minute by minute, not to dramatize her last hours, but to understand the quiet gaps where accountability failed. Financial records confirmed she withdrew a small amount of cash the afternoon of December 23, 1998, consistent with holiday errands and fuel. Her bank statements showed no unusual purchases. The grocery store manager provided payroll logs and employee schedules that confirmed she left alone, after exchanging brief pleasantries with coworkers that carried no significance at the time. Weather reports documented a fast-moving cold front that evening, dropping temperatures below freezing and clearing roads as plows moved through. This detail mattered later, explaining why tire impressions at secondary locations were shallow and incomplete. Daniel Mercer's movements were examined with the same restraint. Employment logs showed he clocked out early that night, citing equipment trouble. A traffic citation issued weeks earlier placed him on the same frontage road where Emily was later found, familiar with pull-offs and service areas. Cell phone data, sparse by modern standards, placed his handset moving north within the same window Emily's phone briefly registered near the riverbank. None of this stood alone. Together, it formed a picture of overlap. Witness interviews were revisited years after memories had cooled. The gas station attendant repeated his recollection without embellishment, the tone of someone who had answered the same questions too many times. A snowplow operator recalled a pickup idling near the decommissioned warehouse around midnight that night, an observation dismissed at the time as unremarkable. A hunter remembered seeing a tarp folded near the riverbank days later, gone by spring. Each statement was logged, cross-referenced, and weighed for reliability. The autopsy report, reread with contemporary understanding, offered hints rather than declarations. The medical examiner testified to injuries consistent with restraint and movement without graphic detail. Exposure played a role, but not the role of cause. Preservation by cold had kept timelines legible. There was no evidence of prolonged suffering, a fact the prosecution noted carefully, avoiding speculation. Forensic accuracy demanded restraint. Media coverage at trial was subdued, reflecting a community older in years and wary of spectacle. Local papers focused on procedure and precedent. Editorials spoke of patience and the value of record-keeping. The courthouse atmosphere was sober. Jurors, many retired or near retirement, took notes with the seriousness of men who had raised families and balanced budgets, attentive to details that accumulate rather than explode. The defense challenged the fiber evidence and the phone records as expected. Experts testified to probabilities and margins of error. The prosecution answered with chain-of-custody logs and independent verification. There were no surprise witnesses. The case rose or fell on the steady alignment of small facts. When the verdict came, it did not provoke celebration. It registered as a closing entry in a ledger. Sentencing statements avoided rhetoric. The judge spoke of harm measured in absence and time. Emily Calder's parents declined public comment beyond a brief acknowledgement of the court's work. They returned to a life reshaped by loss but no longer suspended by uncertainty. For investigators, the aftermath involved paperwork and policy. Evidence handling protocols were updated. Cold case reviews became routine rather than exceptional. In the years following, Utah's law enforcement agencies invested in digitizing archives that had once lived in filing cabinets, brittle and vulnerable to misplacement. Emily's case was cited in training as an example of winter preservation and the importance of revisiting assumptions. It was not held up as a triumph, but as a reminder that procedure endures when attention fades. Ogden itself changed slowly. New businesses opened along Washington Boulevard. The grocery store remodeled. The service pull-off where Emily was found remained unremarkable, plowed and salted, passed by thousands who never knew its history. Seasonal rituals continued. Thanksgiving dinners filled tables. Christmas lights went up against early darkness. New Year's fireworks reflected off snow. Daniel Mercer began his sentence in a state facility south of Salt Lake City. Appeals were filed and denied on predictable grounds. The appellate opinions read like manuals, addressing standards of review and evidentiary thresholds. There were no findings of misconduct. The conviction stood. For the men who worked the case, retirement came. One detective kept a copy of the final report in a box with commendations and old badges. Another moved out of state. Their recollections, when shared, were spare. They spoke of time, of paper, of listening more than talking. They spoke of December as a month that reveals as much as it conceals. Emily Calder's name appears now in a list of resolved cases, align with dates and outcomes. It is an incomplete summary of a life and a thorough summary of an investigation. The quiet aftermath is the truest measure. No lingering questions, no rumors, no unfinished files. Just winter roads, maintained and ordinary, carrying the weight of memory without announcing it. The cold case unit continued its audit after sentencing, treating closure as a responsibility rather than an ending. Supervisors required every exhibit be rechecked, every report reconciled, every interview indexed, because winter cases taught agencies how easily context erodes when files are shelved too soon and staff moves on quietly. Emily Calder's file grew thicker with addenda explaining why early assumptions failed. Investigators documented how missing adult classifications in the 90s limited resources, and how holidays narrowed staffing, slowing follow-up while storms complicated travel. These contextual notes mattered later, teaching reviewers not to judge decisions without understanding conditions, pressures, and the review also mapped seasonal rhythms familiar to older residents: Thanksgiving traffic, Christmas closures, New Year's returns, when routine resumes and records surface. Emily's absence intersected those rhythms, complicating witness availability and altering recollection, a factor later addressed through corroboration rather than memory alone, anchoring claims to documents and timestamps. Property records near the riverbank were examined, showing the warehouse land passed through multiple owners after decommissioning, each transfer logged with county clerks. Investigators traced access roads, knotting winter barriers and plowed turnarounds. This analysis explained how a vehicle could stop briefly without drawing notice, especially during late December nights. Environmental testing was repeated conservatively. Soil chemistry comparisons matched riverbank samples within acceptable margins, reviewed by independent laboratories. Fiber analysis was re-examined using updated microscopy, confirming upholstery consistency without overstating uniqueness. Reports emphasized limitations, a practice aligned with post-conviction scrutiny standards and appellate expectations, reducing risk of overreach in testimony. Phone records required careful explanation for jurors accustomed to landlines. Analysts clarified tower ranges, handoffs, and gaps, demonstrating consistency rather than precision. The brief registration near the riverbank aligned with travel patterns and weather conditions, supporting opportunity without asserting certainty. Such framing respected evidentiary standards and preserved credibility under cross-examination. Investigators also audited alternative suspects named early in the inquiry. Each was reassessed against the refined timeline and excluded by records, employment, or location. This step, documented thoroughly, prevented tunnel vision arguments and demonstrated fairness, a requirement for lawful resolution. The process underscored patience as a virtue rather than weakness. Trial exhibits were archived digitally after verdict, a change prompted by lessons learned. Photographs were labeled with weather notes. Maps included plow routes and closure times. These details ensured future readers understood context beyond images, preventing misinterpretation by those removed from local winters and holiday schedules that shape behavior subtly. Community response remained restrained after sentencing. Churches held quiet services. The university updated safety bulletins. There were no marches or speeches. Older residents recognized the tone, valuing steadiness over display. Local press followed suit, emphasizing process, appeals, and sentencing law, reflecting a readership accustomed to patience and continuity through winters. The appellate decision arrived during late autumn, citing sufficient evidence and proper instructions. Its language was measured, referencing standards familiar to practitioners. By Thanksgiving, the ruling was final. For families, holidays resumed without court dates. For agencies, the case became precedent, instructive rather than celebratory, shaping training and review protocols. Retirement interviews with investigators were recorded for internal knowledge retention. They spoke about weather logs, staffing rosters, and how Christmas leave affected response. These observations were practical, not nostalgic, reinforcing that systems must anticipate human rhythms during holidays when crimes still occur quietly along ordinary roads, unseen until time intervenes. Emily Calder's academic records were returned to her family, a procedural step closing administrative loops. Professors provided summaries noting diligence and reliability. Such details, included in the file, humanized timelines without sentiment. Investigators believed accuracy honors victims better than flourish, a principle reflected throughout the prosecution and subsequent archival practices. The grocery store preserved payroll backups longer than required, responding to requests years later. This cooperation illustrated how small institutions contribute to resolution. Managers understood routine records outlast memory, particularly across winters when staff turns over. Their compliance required no publicity, only trust in lawful process and shared civic responsibility. Training materials developed afterward avoided dramatization. Slides showed checklists, not photographs. Scenarios emphasized December logistics, plow schedules, and court calendars. Recruits learned to document absences around holidays, recognizing that silence can mislead. The case became a lesson repeated annually, reinforcing method over impulse, restraint over narrative, and patience over speed. Public records requests continued from researchers and journalists. Responses remained factual, limited to filings and outcomes. Authorities resisted speculation, mindful of precedent. This approach sustained confidence among older citizens who valued institutions that speak plainly and stop when the record ends, allowing communities to move forward without reopening settled wounds. Seasonal commemorations shifted tone after resolution. Instead of candlelight vigils, families favored private remembrances. Winter walks, quiet meals, and letters replaced uncertainty. Investigators noted how certainty allows grief to stabilize, a psychological observation consistent with casework experience across decades. Closure did not erase loss, but it returned time to calendars. The service pull-off received routine maintenance, nothing more. Snow banks rose and fell each year. No marker was installed. Officials believed ordinary treatment respected the site, preventing pilgrimage. This decision reflected a regional preference for understatement, trusting memory to reside in records and families, not roadside signs exposed to weather. Budget analyses showed the cold case unit's cost-effectiveness. Modest grants yielded durable results. Administrators cited the Calder case when defending funding during fiscal debates near year's end. Numbers mattered to councils facing winter expenses, and the data supported continuity without rhetoric or alarm, aligning prudence with justice outcomes statewide. Legal scholars later referenced the case in journals discussing circumstantial accumulation. The writing avoided narrative, focusing on standards. Footnotes traced soil, fiber, and phone evidence integration. Such analysis reinforced that lawful conclusions emerge from convergence, a lesson emphasized to students preparing for practice in jurisdictions shaped by weather and distance. For Emily Calder's parents, correspondence with agencies slowed naturally. Thank you notes replaced inquiries. They attended fewer meetings, trusting systems again. Holidays remained difficult but predictable. Predictability, investigators observed, is a form of relief earned by answers, allowing families to plan without fear of interruption by unresolved calls, letters, or rumors. The county courthouse updated its archives, migrating microfilm to digital storage. Emily's file gained redundancy, protected from decay. Clerks noted winter humidity risks and planned accordingly. Preservation, they said, is another form of justice, ensuring future reviewers see what happened without guessing, even as seasons change and buildings age quietly. Community education sessions addressed personal safety without alarm. Emphasis rested on routines, winter travel, and reporting concerns. The tone suited an older audience, practical and measured. Officials avoided slogans, choosing checklists. Attendance was steady, reflecting trust rebuilt through outcomes rather than promises, especially before holidays when attention competes with family. Researchers compiling statewide statistics categorized the case as winter-associated. They noted discovery delays tied to weather and reduced activity. Such classifications informed resource allocation. Charts replaced stories, aiding planners responsible for large territories. The approach favored prevention and readiness, reinforcing that seasons shape crime response as much as motive ever. Daniel Mercer's incarceration proceeded without incident. Records show compliance and routine. Appeals exhausted, supervision transferred. Officials documented status annually, another administrative rhythm. The absence of controversy underscored the case's solidity. Justice, in this account, was not dramatic but durable, surviving scrutiny and time without amendment, particularly as years accumulated steadily. Winter anniversaries passed quietly. Snow returned, roads cleared, and archives rested. Investigators measured success by absence of questions. When asked about lessons, they cited diligence, humility, and calendars. These words resonated with older listeners who knew time disciplines all work. The case endured as proof that steadiness closes doors carefully. The local press archived coverage behind paywalls. Headlines softened with age. Readers searching later found facts, not spectacle. Editors believed restraint respects audiences, particularly retirees seeking clarity over noise. This philosophy mirrored the investigation, favoring accumulation and verification through winter cycles rather than urgency driven by novelty, clicks, or outrage. Academic conferences referenced the prosecution when discussing jury comprehension. Presenters noted how plain language aided understanding. December calendars and familiar routines grounded abstract data. This alignment helped jurors evaluate probability. Such insights traveled beyond Utah, informing practice in other cold regions where weather and holidays complicate timelines without changing obligations. Families impacted also found reassurance. A solved case reduces rumor. Community conversations narrowed to verifiable facts. This containment mattered in small towns where winters keep people indoors. Stability returned to routines, reinforcing social trust. Investigators understood trust accumulates slowly, much like evidence, and can be preserved with care over years. Policy memos circulated before year's end, recommending continued audits. Administrators scheduled reviews away from holidays. This timing ensured focus and staffing. The change reflected learning born of winter experience. Planning, they wrote, is justice, reducing future delay and confusion. The memo closed with dates, not slogans, aligning calendars with duty. As another December approached, the case rested complete. Roads would freeze, plows would pass, and files would remain closed. For those who worked it, resolution meant sleep unbroken by questions. The cold had preserved truth, and method had revealed it, leaving a community steady through holidays, winters, and ordinary days. The years following resolution settled into a quieter pattern, and the case became a reference point rather than a presence. Annual reports listed it among completed matters, with footnotes explaining methodology and outcomes. Supervisors ensured that the lessons remained current by revisiting them each December, when staffing schedules tighten and weather reshapes response times across northern Utah. Training emphasized winter documentation, urging officers to log plow routes, road closures, and maintenance schedules alongside witness statements. The Calder investigation demonstrated how ordinary municipal records can become evidentiary anchors years later. Instructors reminded recruits that holidays compress attention and stretch timelines, requiring deliberate redundancy rather than haste. Community relations benefited from the measured handling. Town halls held before Thanksgiving focused on preparedness, not fear. Residents appreciated guidance on winter travel, lighting, and routine check-ins without sensational framing. Older attendees, many retired, recognized the tone as practical and respectful, aligning with values formed over decades of seasonal cycles. The university reviewed its safety communications, standardizing end-of-semester alerts when students travel during storms. Administrators referenced the case indirectly, avoiding names, focusing on process. They coordinated with local transit authorities to publish winter schedules and emergency contacts, acknowledging that predictability reduces risk during December nights. Archivists completed a second migration of files, creating checksum verifications to ensure integrity over time. The Calder materials were among the first validated, chosen for their complexity and instructional value. Clerks documented humidity controls and storage temperatures, recognizing that preservation mirrors investigation in requiring patience and foresight. A decade after sentencing, a legislative committee reviewed cold case funding statewide. Testimony highlighted modest costs and durable benefits, citing the Calder case as evidence that incremental investment yields lawful closure. Budget notes reflected seasonal considerations, scheduling audits outside holidays to maximize availability and focus. The medical examiner's office updated reporting templates, adding clearer language about exposure and time-related changes in remains, shaped by winter experience. These revisions aim to prevent misinterpretation by jurors unfamiliar with cold preservation. The Calder autopsy review informed this effort, contributing to clarity without altering findings. Public records requests declined as years passed. When inquiries arrived, responses remained consistent, providing filings and outcomes without commentary. This steadiness reinforced trust, particularly among older residents who valued institutions that speak once accurately and then allow matters to rest. Families affected by unrelated cases sometimes reached out, seeking reassurance. Investigators shared general lessons about documentation and patience, careful not to promise outcomes. They emphasized that resolution depends on convergence, not urgency, a message resonating with those accustomed to long winters and careful planning. Local media marked anniversaries with brief notices, focusing on procedural milestones rather than narrative. Editors believed readers preferred facts over retrospection. This approach mirrored the original coverage, reinforcing continuity in tone across years and maintaining respect for those directly involved. Seasonal rhythms continued to shape institutional calendars. Evidence audits were scheduled for late winter, when operations stabilize after holidays. Training refreshers occurred in early autumn. These adjustments reflected experience gained from cases like Calder, aligning administrative flow with environmental realities. The service pull-off remained unchanged, its anonymity intentional. Maintenance logs noted routine work only. Officials avoided signage, believing neutrality prevents unintended memorialization that could invite intrusion. This choice aligned with community preference for quiet remembrance and respect for ordinary spaces. Daniel Mercer's status remained static within corrections reports. Annual summaries listed compliance and classification without incident. Appeals exhausted, his case required no further court action. The absence of updates underscored finality, a quality valued by families seeking to move forward without renewed attention. The grocery store updated record retention policies, extending payroll archives beyond minimum requirements during peak seasons. Managers cited the Calder review when justifying storage costs, recognizing how ordinary documents can later support accountability. This institutional memory persisted quietly. Educational workshops for civic groups addressed winter awareness and routine safety. Presenters avoided case specifics, focusing on checklists and preparedness. Attendance remained steady, reflecting trust built through consistent messaging rather than episodic alarm. Legal education programs referenced the case when teaching circumstantial evidence standards. Faculty highlighted how convergence withstands appellate scrutiny. Students learned to respect limits, presenting probabilities honestly. The winter context provided a relatable framework for discussing uncertainty and proof. As years accumulated, personal recollections softened into records. Investigators who had retired were occasionally consulted for training interviews, offering practical advice about calendars, staffing, and weather. Their counsel emphasized humility and persistence, qualities that age tends to prize. Community confidence benefited from the absence of rumor. With facts settled, conversations narrowed. This containment mattered in smaller towns, where winter confines interaction. Stability returned to routines, allowing holidays to be observed without undercurrent. County planners integrated winter response lessons into emergency management. Cross-department coordination improved, linking road maintenance with public safety communications. The Calder case appeared in internal memos as justification, demonstrating how infrastructure data supports investigations indirectly. Families observing anniversaries chose private remembrance. Letters replaced public statements. This shift reflected acceptance enabled by answers. Investigators noted that certainty, even when painful, restores calendar meaning, allowing holidays to be anticipated rather than endured. The courthouse modernized its docket systems, improving access to archived rulings. The Calder appellate decision was indexed for instructional use. Clerks ensured metadata accuracy, recognizing that future readers depend on clarity as much as present jurors did. Regional conferences discussed winter case management, sharing insights across states. Presenters cited Utah's experience without naming individuals, focusing on methods. The exchange reinforced professional norms, emphasizing restraint and verification. As another decade approached, the case receded further into background. Roads iced and cleared as usual. Records remained intact. The work stood complete, not because time erased it, but because method preserved truth through seasons, holidays, and the ordinary passage of years. The quiet endurance of the record became its own assurance. Auditors revisiting the file years later found no gaps, no unexplained decisions, no missing exhibits. Each choice was logged with date and rationale, reflecting a culture shaped by experience. December pressures were acknowledged explicitly, not excused, demonstrating how institutions can adapt without diminishing standards. The town's geography remained a teaching tool. Maps used in training highlighted river corridors, frontage roads, and service pull-offs, emphasizing how infrastructure supports both commerce and concealment. Winter light, low and brief, alters perception. Trainees learn to factor these elements into search planning and witness assessment, grounding theory in local reality. Civic memory matured alongside these practices. Older residents, many of whom had followed the case quietly, spoke of it less often, not from indifference but from confidence. The resolution had integrated into communal understanding, allowing attention to return to present concerns without fear of unfinished business resurfacing each holiday season. Emergency dispatch protocols were refined to flag missing adult reports during major holidays for follow-up scheduling. This change recognized that absence during December carries different implications. The adjustment required no new technology, only disciplined calendar management, a lesson reinforced repeatedly in internal reviews, citing the Calder investigation. Insurance and roadside assistance providers coordinated winter response messaging with local agencies, reducing stranded motorists and potential vulnerabilities. While unrelated to any single case, planners noted how layered prevention reduces opportunity. These efforts reflected a community-wide approach informed by past analysis rather than reactive impulse. The State Crime Lab incorporated seasonal modules into continuing education, addressing evidence stability in cold conditions. Analysts discussed how freezing can preserve some materials while complicating others. The Calder reviews informed these modules, reinforcing accuracy without dramatization. Judicial training seminars referenced the case when discussing jury instructions for circumstantial evidence. Judges emphasized clarity and restraint, ensuring jurors understand accumulation without inference stacking. This pedagogical approach mirrored the original trial's tone and contributed to consistent outcomes. Libraries archived local press coverage with contextual notes, guiding future researchers. Editors collaborated to annotate timelines and corrections. This cooperative effort ensured that public narratives remained aligned with the record, reducing misinterpretation over time. For families entering the justice system later, the case served as quiet reassurance that patience and documentation matter. Advocates shared general insights without comparison, focusing on process. The message resonated particularly with older adults accustomed to deliberate progress and skeptical of spectacle. As winter continued its cycles, the case stood as an example of how ordinary diligence answers extraordinary questions. There were no memorials erected, no anniversaries marked by crowds. Instead, there were calendars kept, roads maintained, and files preserved. In that steadiness, the community found its measure, carrying forward through holidays and years with confidence earned, not claimed. Time continued without ceremony. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. Offices opened and closed on schedule. The record remained unchanged. For those who remembered, the lesson endured. Careful work done patiently closes doors properly. For those who did not, the systems quietly carried forward, prepared for winters to come, guided by files that held steady against weather, calendars, and the long arc of years. In the end, resolution lived not in memory but in method, preserved by routine, review, and respect for time. That steadiness became the community's quiet inheritance through winter nights and ordinary mornings. Nothing more remained unresolved. Finally, in the final accounting, the case settled into the long memory of institutions rather than the short memory of headlines. Auditors reviewing outcomes years later described it as complete, meaning not only adjudicated but understood. Every decision point had documentation. Every delay had context. Every conclusion rested on corroboration. That completeness mattered to a generation that values ledgers balanced and work finished before winter closes roads again. As procedures matured, agencies codified what the investigation had taught them. December staffing plans were revised to ensure continuity. Evidence intake included seasonal checklists. Missing adult reports received scheduled follow-ups after holidays when normal routines resumed. These changes were quiet, administrative, and effective. They did not rely on personalities or luck. They relied on calendars, policies, and respect for time. Emily Calder's name appeared occasionally in training materials, always with restraint. The focus remained on process, not tragedy. Instructors emphasized how modest records carried extraordinary weight years later. Payroll logs, gas receipts, maintenance schedules, and phone metadata were presented as tools available to any diligent investigator. The lesson was practical and reassuring. Lawful closure is built from ordinary work done carefully. The community's relationship with the case matured into something stable. Residents who remembered the uncertainty also remembered the resolution. Conversations referenced the outcome without speculation. Trust in local institutions strengthened, particularly among older citizens who had watched cycles of change and understood the value of consistency. The absence of controversy became its own evidence of sound practice. Courthouse operations reflected that maturity. Clerks ensured long-term accessibility of rulings. Judges referenced the appellate decision when clarifying standards in later cases. The language used in court remained plain, favoring comprehension over flourish. This style aligned with jurors accustomed to careful reading and measured judgment, reinforcing confidence in outcomes. The correction system maintained routine oversight. Annual reports listed status without incident. There were no hearings, no transfers of note, no developments requiring public attention. Finality endured. For families, this steadiness meant holidays passed without the anticipation of news. For institutions, it meant resources could be directed elsewhere, guided by lessons learned. Local press coverage thinned naturally. Archivists preserved articles with annotations noting corrections and outcomes. Editors believed completeness required context, preventing future readers from mistaking early uncertainty for unresolved truth. This curatorial role supported civic understanding long after attention faded. Educational institutions incorporated winter safety planning into orientation materials. Messaging emphasized routine awareness during travel-heavy seasons. Administrators coordinated with local agencies to share schedules and contacts. These efforts acknowledged environmental realities without invoking fear, reflecting a community preference for preparedness grounded in experience. Professional conferences continued to reference the case obliquely. Presenters discussed convergence of circumstantial evidence, chain of custody rigor, and seasonal context. Attendees appreciated examples that demonstrated restraint. The absence of spectacle reinforced credibility, encouraging adoption of similar practices across jurisdictions with comparable climates. Family advocacy groups found reassurance in the outcome. Without invoking comparison, they shared general guidance on documentation and patience. The message resonated with older adults who valued steady progress over dramatic promises. Closure, they learned, arrives through persistence rather than publicity. County planning integrated lessons into emergency management. Cross-department data sharing improved. Road maintenance logs synchronized with dispatch systems. These improvements reduced blind spots during winter operations. The Calder case appeared in internal justifications as proof that infrastructure data supports justice indirectly. Libraries curated local history exhibits emphasizing process and community resilience. The case appeared as a footnote among broader narratives about winter, work, and record-keeping. Visitors encountered facts without dramatization, aligning memory with accuracy. As years accumulated, the case receded further into background. Investigators who had worked it retired. Their guidance lived on in manuals and schedules. Younger officers learned from systems rather than stories. This transition ensured continuity independent of individual recollection. Holiday seasons returned with familiar rhythms. Thanksgiving traffic slowed highways. Christmas lights reflected on snow. New Year calendars turned. The absence of unresolved questions allowed these rituals to proceed without undertone. Predictability restored meaning to dates once associated with uncertainty. Institutional audits confirmed durability. No exhibits were missing. No reports conflicted. Digital backups matched originals. Checksums verified integrity. Preservation had succeeded. This outcome mattered to administrators accountable for stewardship across decades. Community confidence manifested quietly. Attendance at safety workshops remained steady. Trust surveys showed incremental improvement. Residents reported concerns promptly, confident in follow-up. These metrics reflected a relationship strengthened by consistent practice rather than episodic reassurance. Legal scholarship continued to cite the case for its methodological clarity. Articles emphasized how winter conditions interact with evidence stability. Footnotes detailed standards rather than narratives. The work contributed to broader understanding without personalizing tragedy. For Emily Calder's family, the passage of time allowed grief to settle into remembrance. They maintained privacy. Correspondence with agencies ceased naturally. The certainty provided by resolution enabled planning without interruption. Holidays became manageable, anchored by memory rather than waiting. The service pull-off remained unmarked and ordinary. Maintenance continued as scheduled. Snowbanks rose and fell. Officials believed neutrality honored both place and people, preventing distortion of memory. The site's ordinariness reinforced the lesson that truth often hides in plain spaces, revealed only by careful work. As systems matured, the case became less an example and more a baseline. New investigations were measured against its standards. Deviations prompted review. This quiet benchmarking elevated practice without invoking past pain. When asked about success, administrators spoke of documentation, patience, and calendars. They avoided superlatives. The tone resonated with an audience that values work completed properly, without shortcuts. The message held across winter meetings and end-of-year reports. In the end, the resolution endured because it required nothing further. No anniversaries demanded attention. No rumors required correction. The record stood intact, supported by method and verification. Time tested it and found it stable. Winter continued its cycles, indifferent and instructive. Roads froze and cleared. Offices closed for holidays and reopened. Files rested. The community moved forward, carrying forward systems shaped by experience. In that continuity lay the quiet measure of justice achieved, preserved, and allowed to remain undisturbed.